The story of Tim Hornbaker's new book, Death of the Territories, is one that's been told 100 times across various mediums. Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation's meteoric rise to the top of pro wrestling and the transformation of the industry from small regional powerhouses to a behemoth bigger than the sport has ever seen. What helps Death of the Territories stand out from the crowd, though, is telling the story differently than any book before it. Death of the Territories is a unique trip down memory lane, aided by the expert weaving of newspaper quotes, detailed discussions of television contracts, and anecdotes that combine to provide a well-traveled story from a new and interesting perspective. Devoted pro wrestling fans know the basic premise of the story, but they may not know how important a role regional television networks played in the rise. They may not know the turmoil within NWA that caused it to slowly fracture, and most of all, they probably haven't heard or seen the many quotes throughout the book from industry leaders and territorial leaders at the time, seemingly unaware of the fate that would soon meet. Death of the Territories begins by introducing each of the major players of the industry at the time, the major territories, and the style behind each of those territories. While I appreciate the detailed look at each region, I can understand how a non-wrestling fan may be confused at first glance. Very little attention was given to explaining the territorial system. Most of us reading Death of the Territories won't need a primer for the territorial system. We know why it existed, and we know how important it was in forming the American pro wrestling industry at the time. We're good. Your casual fan may require more explanation to fully understand how different and unique pro wrestling was at the time. You can't appreciate the rest of this book without a complete understanding of the systems that allowed it to be constructed. This is one of the few negatives of Death of the Territories. Still, Hornbaker introduces the narrative by laying out the formation of the National Wrestling Alliance, why it was so important to pro wrestling at the time, and how even from day one it felt untenable. Hornbaker's ability to help you peer into the psyche of each and every major territory helps better foreshadow how and why they would fall in the years that followed. Death of the Territories attempts and succeeds in making each territory feel unique to help formulate a narrative structure. Death of the Territories really shines once the introductions are out of the way and Hornbaker can start showing off the breadth of his research. Once Hornbaker is allowed to take the kid gloves off and go inside baseball, the book goes into overdrive. The integration of newspaper quotes and clippings, combined with a near overwhelming amount of television station call letters, helped this book stand out among its predecessors. At times, Death of the Territories becomes a book centered more on the inner workings of 70s and 80s regionalized television than that of a pro wrestling book. As a nerd of television history, this is right up my alley. But fans anxious for an exclusively pro wrestling book may be disappointed. In Hornbaker's defense, and he does a fantastic job of defending this throughout, the story of American pro wrestling cannot be told without also telling the history of television at the time. In Death of the Territories, you'll see pro wrestling through the scope of regionalized television and see it through the rise of cable and eventually pay-per-view. You'll learn why McMahon's shrewd and sometimes expensive plan to take over the pro wrestling world worked, and you'll see just how close it came to sending him and the entire company into bankruptcy. This book is as much a history of television as it is a telling of pro wrestling history. While I earlier criticized the lack of approachability with regards to the territorial system, Hornbaker's reliance on television history could help this book reach a scope well beyond wrestling fans. I could have absolutely seen myself reading this during my television history class in college. Some readers may be disappointed by the anticlimactic finish to the story, as Hornbaker discusses McMahon's destruction of the territorial system, but does very little to foreshadow the impending war between WWF and WCW. To me, though, that wasn't a big deal. The book doesn't advertise itself as being the complete history of Vince McMahon. It's as much about the fragmentation of American pro wrestling as it is about the man on the cover. It's as much about the evolving landscape of television in the early 80s as it is about McMahon's place in the pro wrestling world. Speaking of the cover, one may surmise that Death of the Territories is a Vince McMahon hit piece, designed to look at how he destroyed all that old school wrestling fans loved about pro wrestling. It's quite the contrary, though. There is negativity directed at McMahon, of course, but most of it comes in the form of newspaper quotes from territorial promoters seeing their impending doom drawing closer by the day. Death of the Territories does a fair job of delving into how close McMahon came to bankruptcy and how a few small transactions, including one from New Japan Pro Wrestling's Antonio Inoki, likely saved them and helped transform pro wrestling. Likewise, the regional promoters of the era were all given fair representation as well. Some, like Bill Watts, saw the writing on the wall and adjusted with the changing times. Others were insistent that the pro wrestling that they had created, that they grew up with, that would be the pro wrestling forever. They held tight onto the deck chairs, as the industry they knew was quickly sinking into the ocean. Where WWE's self-produced telling of this story typically paints the old-school wrestling promoter as a chain-smoking, old-school, out-of-touch imbecile, Death of the Territories paints them as smart businessmen, unsure and unable to adjust to the rapidly changing world around them. The promoters are presented not as out of touch, but rather living by an if it ain't broke, don't fix it mantra. Some saw the system breaking before them, others waited too long. This representation does a service to McMahon and the story, as WWF doesn't just trounce a collection of old boobs easily, but rather they scratch and claw their way to the top of the pro wrestling world. Like pro wrestling, you want to paint your opponents as powerful, because it helps the conquering wrestler appear stronger. Death of the Territories at no times makes it appear easy for McMahon or the WWF to assume power. It took time, it took effort, and most importantly, it took money. And many times, it almost didn't happen. This differs greatly from the story WWE likes to tell in their own recall. Death of the Territories is simply a must-read for all pro wrestling fans, as detailed a look at this time period as I've ever seen. Hornbaker should be complimented for taking a unique, refreshing approach to the topic and knocking it out of the ballpark. Some may find the book overly detailed and boring at times, but those who are actively looking to become better educated on the topic will find a near textbook level of insight and research. Casual fans may be lost in the book's early moments, but should stick with it, as they'll be bound to find something to sink their teeth into. There are some flaws with Death of the Territories, but all in all, this is the new standard bearer in books for this era of pro wrestling. I simply cannot recommend it enough.